This is Father Gregory Pine.
And this is Father Patrick Briscoe.
And welcome to Godsplaining. Thanks to all those who support us. If you enjoyed the show, please consider making a monthly donation on Patreon. Be sure to like and subscribe to Godsplaining wherever you listen to your podcasts. So for this episode of Guestsplaining, we're very delighted to be joined by my former cross-country coach, my brother's former professor of biology, Father Patrick's former something. We haven't yet established that connection. But everyone's former, well, this is just Professor Dan Kuebler from Franciscan University of Steubenville. Thanks so much for joining.
Well, Father Gregory, Father Patrick, thanks for having me on. I'm glad to be here.
Cheers. All right. So the history runs deep. You have known me at my worst, that is to say, wearing short shorts and progressively dying on an 8-kilometer course. But for those who haven't had such experiences in their life, would you say a word of introduction, who you are, where you're from, and what you do?
Yeah, great. My claim to fame is I was Father Gregory's college cross-country coach, and then everything else is just sort of secondary from there. I teach, I've been at Franciscan, a professor of biology at Franciscan. I've been here 22 years, and I've been cross-country coach 21 years. I do research on adult stem cells from bone marrow and fat. And I teach courses in cell biology. That's my background, but I also teach a course in evolution. And I do, particularly the last 5 or 6 years, been teaching courses in science and faith and looking at the integration of a lot of different issues that come up in science and how do we think about them from a Catholic perspective.
Nice. Okay. We connected recently at a Thomistic Institute natural philosophy and science conference over the summer, and then we followed up a few months later for a recording of the Purposeful Lab podcast that you do at the Magis Center. Could you just tell us a little bit about that work?
Yeah, the Purposeful Lab, and again, thanks for coming on that podcast. It was great to see you and talk to you on that. It's basically we are looking at trying to see from a scientific perspective, look at the order that you see in the universe at all levels, and what does that mean? What's the meaning of the purpose behind sort of this very ordered and structured universe that chemistry, biology, and physics can describe? So, a lot of people say the deeper you get into science, the further away you get from God, as if there's science and God are fighting here for explanations. When in reality, it should be, it's sort of foundational level. There's certain foundation of why do things exist? Why is there order? Right? And those metaphysical questions need to be answered first before you can even do any science. So science doesn't compete with those bigger questions, but it does raise those when you do science. As a scientist, why is the universe ordered? Why are there things? Why can my mind understand the universe to some extent? And those deeper questions should bring you to God rather than take you away. And that's sort of the thing we focus on that podcast, looking at science and how it bleeds in naturally to open these bigger, deeper philosophical and theological questions.
Dan, there's not a listener of our podcast that thought maybe you were my cross-country coach. I don't want to open this up bragging, but I'm walking about a 20-minute mile these days, so it's pretty impressive, I'd say. But I do think when people start to look at the universe, and Catholics who have maybe just a basic understanding of evolution, it seems like there are some fundamental principles though that are opposed to what you just said. So a lot of people, when they think about evolution, think of a theory that involves a lot of random developments or movements and improvements among organisms that are not ordered, and that precisely because of this more chaotic approach, or because of the differentiations that develop, that's in fact how the universe changes. So can you talk a little bit about how an understanding of evolution isn't actually opposed to the view of the universe as ordered?
Yeah, that's a common misperception that people have when they think about evolution. They ask people, what comes to mind? And usually it's like, scientific, I think chance or randomness, right? And then they think, well, if we humans are the product of this chance process, right? How in the heck can we be made in the image and likeness of God, who ordained us to be from all eternity? So how are we the purposeful outcome of a chance process, right? There's some tension there that people have, and often, particularly because it's exploited by sort of the atheists to say and drive a wedge between the science of evolution and Christian belief. People just say, well, evolution can't be true because there must be something wrong with it at its heart, because it doesn't seem to be able to be integrated with a Catholic understanding of purpose, the purpose of humans. Now, there's two major issues with that argument. There are problems, and the first is philosophical, which you guys could do a much better job talking about than I can. But that is the thing. Aquinas talked about this, well before Darwin, 600 some years before Darwin. How do you integrate chance and providence? Right? That's not a question that's unique to evolution. Right? We have to integrate chance and providence every day in our lives. There are chance encounters that we have with people, chance events, that we have. Me meeting my wife was a chance event. It wasn't as if I was, there was a law of physics that made me, have to end up meeting her. Right? There was a lot of chance encounters, but at the same time, I think that that's providence. And the idea that it's either chance did it or God did it is that secondary and primary causation that Aquinas talks about, that whatever God deems to happen by contingency or chance happens by contingency or chance, and whatever happens by law or order, that's what God had deemed it to happen by. So philosophically, there is no problem with relying on a chance process. God could use chance processes for his purposes, and he does all the time. We humans use chance processes for our own purposes, right? So, casinos use chance processes to make lots of money. So this idea that chance and purpose are fundamentally opposed, I think is problematic, just from a philosophical perspective.
I think maybe Catholics coming from a non-scientific background, or Catholics who just haven't had the opportunity to inquire closely into the question, often find themselves in the position where they think that they have to choose. So not merely between chance and purpose, but like between an orthodox understanding of creation and a seemingly heterodox acceptance of certain aspects of the theory of evolution. So the way that it's often posed is dichotomous or diametrical. And so people might not know what they think about it, but they feel almost committed by contrariety. It's like, well, I know that I'm not heterodox, so I must think this.
Right.
It's like the way in which, Catholics sometimes formulate their opinions by contrariety to Protestant positions. It's like, well, they say we're justified by faith, so maybe we're just justified by works. It's like, how does this exactly go? So for the person who might not know a lot about the issue, what's being claimed by an orthodox understanding of creation? What's being claimed by a kind of scientific notion of evolution? And what are like points in which, or places in which, you see those kind of both ending to make up a verb that doesn't exist and will never exist, but is helpful for our purposes?
Right. I think the tendency is to make them dichotomous, right? And the reality, and this is often the Catholic view of the world, it's a both and situation, but it's a both and under certain understanding, certain circumstances, right? So you have to clarify what that means. So evolution, for example. So when we talk about the science of evolution, there are those that argue that evolution can explain the totality of man, that scientific theory can explain everything there is to know about man. And that's a philosophical claim, because science only studies the material physical world. And so if you claim that science can explain the entirety of man, you're claiming that man is nothing more than a material being, right? And so when we talk about, the science of evolution, say, well, science can explain, or has the ability to possibly explain, the emergence of the physical aspects of the human person. Like, there's a physical body that we inhabit that has very much similarities with other creatures, right? And we are, and I would say we are the product of an evolutionary process, but at the same time, we're also the product of creation. We are created and evolved at the same time, because man is more than just a physical being. And so it's just the idea that evolution produces the type of entity that's fitting to possess a rational soul. So when that thing comes into existence, that is a moment of creation, because that is not something the evolutionary process can provide. It provides the thing that is fitting to be ensouled. So it's a both and situation, right? And evolution often becomes, and this is where Catholics, sort of recoil from it, and rightly so, when it becomes a materialistic philosophy, right? And so, there are many that think, oh, evolution can explain our moral reasoning. It can explain our conscious, our free will, and our intellect and will. But those things are things that go beyond the material. And so the science is never going to be able to explain them. So having the proper understanding of what science can and can't explain is important for framing the evolution creation discussion, right? And then on the side of creation, what is it that we are looking at in the first few chapters of Genesis? And for me, I always go back to a small book that Pope Benedict wrote back in the 1980s. In the beginning, it's a series of 4 homilies. I give it to all my students. It's just a very concise sort of framework. He doesn't answer all the questions, because nobody's able to answer all these questions. There's a lot of things that are still a mystery to us, but he does frame it in a way that gives us a space to explore these issues. So what does the creation story tell? What are the truths that it's getting at? That we are made in the image likeness of God, that we are meant for worship, right? That we are, distinct. There's something unique about our nature that makes us stand apart from all creation, yet we are part of creation, right? So it's, again, a both and, right? And I think it's sort of a beautiful image to see that God creates a universe that's extremely structured and ordered, in which at every stage it's progressing towards something, right? And the Catechism talks about God created the universe on a journey towards its ultimate perfection, right? And the universe is created on a journey towards bringing mankind into existence. And so we are, as Genesis account says, we're made from, the dirt, right? But that dirt, is this the physical nature of us, this being part of this physical creation that brings forth the type of thing that God from all eternity wanted to be in relation to him, in a special relation to him, which evolutionary history sets up salvation history, right? The two they connect in the human person, right? I think it's like that, and I think that's a beautiful way of looking at, rather than being, I can sort of, plug my nose and accept evolution a little bit, but I'm going to have to be a little squeamish about my theology. I think it illuminates, the centrality of what humans are for, our ultimate destiny, and what creation is for.
Yeah, so I want to lean on this point and develop a little bit about what evolution can teach us as Catholics. What are the important things that you think we need to know about this scientific theory? And I want to ask that question because of a common polarization we have right now, right? Which is basically science is great and religious people are morons, and modern progress is the best thing that's ever happened, and everyone who came before us in the ancient world was an idiot at best. Possibly other things that we can't say because YouTube's will get upset at us. So with that in mind, I'd like to reverse engineer it a little bit and just ask, well, what does the scientific theory offer us in our own self-understanding? Because of course on Godsplaining, we value the ancient things. We value the sacred text. We have a lot to say philosophically about what's going on here. But what's important for everyone, every Catholic, to know about the science, and what does the scientific theory again help us to better illuminate about our own understanding of human beings and what life is and what life is for?
Yeah, no, I think one of the things that I always stress is that, because evolution scientifically, people often associate with just chance and randomness, right? And there is elements of chance in evolution, without a doubt. But I think what, how did humans get to come into existence through an evolutionary process, right? There is a huge amount of order that has to be there, right? For a universe to exist, that evolution is even possible, right? There's a huge amount of order at the level of the physics, right? to create the elements. The question is, well, why do we live in a universe that only has, right, basically 90 some stable elements, right? Why don't we live in a universe with 2 or 4 or 100 or 500? Well, it's the order at the subatomic level that gives rise to those elements, and gives rise to those elements in a very particular way. And those elements then create molecules, and then those molecules exist because of the underlying order in the chemistry and physics. And that underlying order that's there sort of directs and moves evolution in certain directions. That evolution is, in some sense, this is like, it's not a perfect analogy, but Augustine talks about, the potentiality that's in creation, right? So from the beginning, there's this potentiality in creation to produce the elements, the molecules, the organisms, and eventually humans. And that potentiality unfolds over time in a beautiful, almost free plan, right? So it's my friend uses the analogy of jazz music, where that there can be all these unique riffs, but there's this underlying structure there to the song. You can play the same, when the Saints Come Marching In, you can play that song in a million different ways, but it's the same sort of song underneath. There's this order there, but this freedom there in creation. And I think there's an analogy with the way God works with us, right? We have this freedom that God has granted us, but there's this order and this limitation. We can't do anything, right? But there's a freedom that God gives to creation, but that freedom doesn't thwart what he wants to do. God is able to use our freedom to bring forth what he wills. And I think that's the way evolution works. And I think that's the way it works in our lives. So I think there's these deep theological parallels there, I think, with looking at that order and structure in evolution, and also the freedom that creation has. It's not an absolute freedom, just like we don't have absolute freedom. I can't just start floating away. I can't, turn myself into 3 different individuals right now. There's certain things that I can and can't do, but I do have this freedom that God works through if I cooperate with them.
You can run an 800-meter race very quickly, though, and I think that your record might still stand here across the street at the Catholic University of America. So, as it turns out, it's great. Yeah, I think most people, well, at least I would prefer being able to run quickly to being able to presence myself in threefold fashion. I feel like the latter option would get really confusing interpersonally or intrapersonally, depending on, never mind. But okay, so I have some questions. So you hear various objections to a kind of theistic evolution. One that I've heard is, how do you get what is higher from what is lower? There's like this sense that the theory of evolution puts forward a kind of metaphysical bootstrapping, whereby better things are coming from lower things, but like, from whence the resources, from whence the energy? And then another one is like, it seems wasteful, because for every species that we have at present, there have been X number of species, to the order of 10s or 20 or 30 times as many species in the past that have come into existence and gone out of existence, which are at present extinct as part of this so-called evolutionary process. So then it would seem to suggest that like God is wasteful, or that God is unconcerned about the fates of species who come and go, so that he can serve his like malign purpose of crafting a perfect thing for the year like 3022. Like what? So I don't know whether these objections, or if certainly there are probably better objections, but what objections do you think merit a response, and then how do you begin to give one?
Yeah, no, I think, I hear those objections, and I think those are 2 really common ones. And let's start with the latter and then go back to the former. So, one of the things about the evolutionary process is that it allows the unfolding of more things to exist, more species to exist than a sort of a static universe. It's actually more creative in a sense. And I think there's a beauty to that. And the idea that a creature, you should be here for eternity or should always exist, that's the way God would have done it, is sort of a very, I think, anthropomorphic view of God, that if a creature isn't here for me to see, then why would God do that? Why would he have had those go extinct? Where I think it shows God's sort of creative power. And also there's this idea of life and death and rebirth. Like certain species go extinct, but they give rise to new and more exciting species. And that's sort of a theme of, say, salvation history, right? This central theme of death and rebirth that you see in evolutionary process, which I don't think detracts in any way or shape or form from our understanding of the Christian God. I think that's very much synergistic with that understanding. And actually, I think makes God as a creator more majestic, that you can have all these different creatures that wouldn't be able to coexist on the planet at the same time. The other objection, this more philosophical objection that I hear, that how do you create the higher from the lower? Like how does you go from a species that doesn't have limbs to a species that's more complex and has limbs, right? Where's that the order coming from, right? And the resources for that. And I think one of the things to recognize with the evolutionary process is, like, if you just zoom in on just like the physical processes, it's like, oh, this fish is giving rise to a tetrapod thing with 4 limbs, right? Okay, so how do fish do that? Fish don't have the resources to do that, right? But it's not sort of the fish that's doing that. It's everything. It's all of creation is bringing this forth, right? The resources to produce a tetrapod are there in creation, right? And it's made manifest through this interaction between all kinds of different creatures, right? And all kinds of living creatures and non-living creatures, all these different forces that bring it about. So there's this huge amount of order that's there at the beginning that is even greater and more beautiful than sort of the creatures often that emerge from that order, right? Even like Aquinas talks about, the idea that, you could get like maggots from the slime, right? So but what does he say? There's this focusing power, like in the sun or something like that. I'm not an Aquinas expert, but I think, but the idea there is there is within creation, in the created world, there is this ability to bring forward these things from the whole system, right? Aquinas got some of his biology right, but I think that notion there that there's these potentialities that can be brought forth through natural processes. And then when you get to humans, we aren't ever, as a Catholic, we're not going to argue that that creation, the natural processes alone, could bring forth the human person in its totality, right? So that's where, as a Catholic, we have this very distinct and bright red line. It's like, no, there is something about the human person that goes beyond the material, right? And so the evolutionary process can't explain the human person in its entirety. So, our rationality, our language, our free will, our intellect are things that are immaterial, that are part of the fact that we're an ensouled, body. But we do share this sort of evolutionary history with these other organisms, and it's a both and so there are certain things that God, when you come to humans, that God had to gift to creation, but there's many other things that creation was gifted to at the beginning, I think.
I actually want to pick up your last comment there and push that a little bit further. So what do you say, Professor, to people who have a concern about the relation that human beings, that Homo sapiens has to other creatures in the created order? So, for example, you hear it put, in probably its most facile form. Do you really think that human beings could be descendants from apes?
Right.
How is it that you address this? Because on the one hand, of course, it's the immaterial aspect and ensoulment that the church would teach that is really what makes a human being to be created in the image and likeness of God, and that's a strong resolution with the sacred text. But on the other hand, we know we're our bodies, and we know that there are many experiences of life shared among all mammals, and that's part of the reality that we're accounting for. So what do you say to that objection? or to that
Yeah.
concern, maybe.
Yeah, no, that's one that I often hear students raise, or when I give talks that people will raise. And so you step back and think of, okay, in the Genesis text about taking dirt, God takes dirt and breathes life into it, right? And to me, it's what is if is there more dignity in taking dirt and breathing life into it than there is taking a hominid, an advanced hominid, and God breathing that life into it? So either way, right? God has to transform. It transforms the material world, right? We are something. As I said, there is this moment that human beings are created, and there is matter, and where that matter comes from, I find it more beautiful to see that God and creation, which we're meant to steward, creation has produced and brought us forward such that we become the type of creature that God can breathe human life into, rather than some miraculous event. I think that connects us with the creative world in a way that's very profound and beautiful. I think it gives us a kinship with the organisms and a stewardship, because this is what brought us forward in a very real way, this creation. And I think there's a beauty to that is lost if you want to just separate man outside of it. And then the reality is, we know we are not separated outside. We suffer from the same hunger pains and sort of physiology that the other primates deal with, right? And so there's this natural affinity and kinship. And
I suspect that's true for most people, but I was delivered by a stork, so.
Okay, so yeah, and one of the things is like, oh, that's an affront to human dignity to put us down into the animals. But I think, again, I looked at theological parallels here, right? So if God can stoop as low to take on a human form, that divide is infinitely greater than the divide between an advanced hominid that we have emerged from. So it doesn't. There's a parallel there. I think that I think sort of suggests that that's not antithetical to the way that God works and operates. So.
All right, we have time for one more question. So here it comes. In the post-COVID dispensation, I think a lot of people are just kind of sad and angry about the way in which quote-unquote science represented, I don't know, an affront to their ordinary sensibilities. Or
you forgot to bow your head gently as you said the word science. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, no. So all right, just thinking about this in terms of the meme culture. You see memes where it's like on the one side you've got science, and on the other side you've got conspiracy theorists, and there are two columns, and there's 18 check marks among the conspiracy theorists and none among the sciences. So I think that people justly frustrated with the implementation of policies and the kind of distribution of misinformation, the conscious distribution of misinformation / limitation of good information, are forget science. And you think about with vaccines. Vaccines have saved many people's lives. And then this vaccine came out and certain governments adopted certain policies which threw people for a loop. And then now a lot of people are pulling back from vaccines writ large. Which is we can discuss that issue. I'm not fit to discuss that issue. But what I'm interested in is quote unquote trusting the science, because, oh my gosh, I just put up scare quotes in a way that triggered the software that we use for recording podcasts in a way that I've never seen before. So I'm so pleased with that. Okay, so trusting the science, quote unquote, in a way that a lot of people now have super negative associations. So you as a Catholic, as a practitioner of science, you're invested in kind of healing and growing people beyond some of the trauma that they suffered in the last 4 years. What are ways in which Catholics can get back to a kind of equilibrium in their kind of approach to practice of appreciation for science, so-called?
Yeah, I mean, how do Catholics get back to that? I think it's a behooves scientists and particularly Catholic scientists to recognize and to frame properly what science can do and what it can't do, and as a tool that can be used in multiple ways, right? And so often, this idea of just follow the science, right? Well, you can't. The science doesn't tell you what to do. It tells you what is, or at least what it, probabilistically what is. So these are the odds of this and that, at least as far as we know. That's all it tells you, right? Then the question of what do we do with that is a deeper question, and that brings up all kinds of philosophical, theological, sociological, economic issues, right? And so recognizing that, and for scientists to recognize that it was used improperly, as if it was a way to short circuit what should have been legitimate discussions. And I'm not going to get into it and come out on one side of the issue, but they should have had a more robust societal discussion about how are we going to respond to this? What do we want to do? What do we value? Why do we value it? And then what are we going to do? And that's the way science should operate, right? And, we saw that with, stem cell research back, 20 years ago, with embryonic stem cell research, when it was really getting off the ground, and sort of petered out now because it hasn't panned out in the way people argue. But the point is, why do we want to do this? Where was that bigger discussion in society? Why do we want to go down this road? What are we trying to get out of it? And what are the economic costs? What are the philosophical, what are the theological costs? Because the science can't tell us what to do, right? It can only give us options of what is possible and what seems to be likely. Science is, and to be a scientist, is always tentative. And so we make the best decisions based on the data that we have. And so the idea that the science is settled and is going to always give us the marching orders is just a total misconception of what science is. And I think that's one of the problems with science, and one of the problems with the modern university, because most scientists never have taken a philosophy course or have an understanding of how science integrates into a bigger picture of knowledge, right? And I was blessed, to have gone to Catholic University and be an English major and have taken full philosophy courses. I'm no way an expert in it, but at least I have this ability to realize, okay, I'm not talking about science now. I just stepped over into philosophy and theology. So I'm going to admit that that's what I'm doing, right? And so that's what scientists loved to do philosophy, but they often don't recognize they are doing philosophy. They still think they're doing science. And so when that's the case, they're usually doing bad philosophy.
Yeah, and as a result of which, bad science. So
right.
Here we are. I wish that I conformed to the standard of methodological rigor that you yourself describe, but I find that often enough I say that I'm doing philosophy and theology, but what I'm doing, in fact, is wild opinion, something like poetry, and who knows what else. Woo! Great.
The same thing can happen in science. I'm just doing, it's like the same thing. I'm just throwing chemicals into a bottle, or am I really doing science?
Hey, there you go. Well,
I do that in the rec room. It's called a cocktail shaker.
Nice. Father Patrick for the win. Great. Well, we've come to the end of our time here. I want to direct listeners' attention to the Purposeful Lab podcast that you do with the Magis Center. Are there other places in which they can kind of follow up with your work apropos of this theme, faith in science, or maybe even evolution more particularly?
Yeah, one place that listeners can follow up is the Society of Catholic Scientists website. I'm the vice president of that organization. And if you go to that website, just search the Society of Catholic Scientists. There's a lot of interesting articles there written by both scientists, theologians, philosophers about all kinds of issues, from evolution to cosmology to reductionism to the brain and consciousness, all even about the afterlife. What does our body look like in heaven? So there's theological speculations as well there. So if you're interested in these issues, you could spend a good amount of time wasted on that site. So.
I once heard of a Dominican friar realizing that something was online. He was of an older generation, so upon this recognition, he asked a younger friar to print it for him. So if you want to read up, you can either read it on the internet or have someone print it for you and then read it in hard copy form.
There you go.
We like to encourage technological advance here on Godsplaining. All right. Well, again, thanks so much for taking the time. Thanks so much for giving the explanations. And I look forward to our next run-in, whether in Alexandria, Virginia, Washington, D.C., or Steubenville, Ohio.
Great. Yeah, it's great to see both of you, Father Greg and Father Patrick, and really enjoyed the conversation. So, and thanks for all you guys do on Godsplaining.
Hey, cheers. As to what that is, we're still trying to figure out. But once we do, we'll let you know.
Let everybody know.
Yeah, exactly.
It's an
All right,
experiment.
folks. Yeah, an experiment in whimsy. We were trying to come up with what do you call those things? Mottos at one point, and it used to be contemplative preachers, contemporary age, but we could never remember that. I especially could never remember that, and I always butchered it. So most recently we came up with conversation for conversion, which I actually think is decent. But the other leading candidate in my own little mind was whimsy and a veil of tears.
That's more marketable.
Yeah, exactly. People it's like kind of depressing, but also charming. It's like, exactly. Great. Well, here we go. Turning to you, the listener, thanks so much for tuning into this episode of Godsplaining. Be sure to like and subscribe on whatever platform you consume your podcast from. If you would, leave a little 5-star review, as that helps to get the word out, and more people will see it come across their feed. If you'd like to donate to the podcast, you can follow the link in the description or show notes to donate on Patreon. In those same description and or show notes, you also find links for merchandise and for upcoming Godsplaining events, the details of which are awesome. So we got some retreats, we got some one-day events, and we hope to see you there. So thanks to the generosity of benefactors, we have them priced as inexpensively as possible. I think some of them cost $0. So, boom. All right, folks, know of our prayers for you. Please pray for us, and we'll look forward to chatting with you next time on Godsplaining.